We're here in Monte Carlo for the Rendez-vous de Septembre. For AMBest TV, I'm Richard Banks. And I'm joined now by Kirill Savrassov, Chief Executive of the Fundamentals of Insurance-Linked Securities run by Phoenix CRetro. Kirill, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting for this interview.
So Kirill, there seems to be some very different views in circulation about the state of the ILS market. How's the role of ILS developed and what are the future opportunities?
Obviously, ILS have quite a big room to expand. However, there are some natural ceilings which we all need to overcome. Obviously, this is a question of those investors who already allocated to look for same products but on the different territories with a known product, because otherwise you are going to be overexposed to Florida wind, for example. And there is a very interesting situation when there is a very small niche, quite profitable if you do proper underwriting, but it works only for small allocations, because when you've got a large allocation, it's difficult, otherwise you will be sitting in each and every Florida exposure. So development of further territories should be of a great help. Also development of some new products, and the wonderful example would be the cyber ILS, which is in the process of development now. It took, if I remember, probably something like 5 years to mature, but nevertheless we already have it, and there is a room for expansion there as well as a new product. So whatever else the use of the principle of securitization can be implied, and since it's interesting for investors, there could be a very big growth. Obviously, working in ILS field, we are all not satisfied probably by the pace at which it develops, but it definitely going larger and larger and taking its place in the reinsurance, global reinsurance capital.
So you talked about investor interest there. How has investors' expectations and attitudes towards reinsurance risk changed?
Well, the immediate reaction obviously is a recalculation of some exposure when the attachment points rise a little bit. But considering historically high spreads for the investors and considering the overall stable outlook for reinsurance industry, I think that it will self-adjust because it is always a compromise between risk and appetite for the interest. But since investors are very cautious about looking after money which they put in, I think it's kind of a self-adjustment process.
Excellent. So there's a lot of talk here in Monte Carlo about the so-called protection gap. What role has ILS got in filling that gap?
There is a very interesting question, and it recalls very much from what we have been saying for the last decade or so. It may look like protection of old ties, but to my opinion, ILS is one of the primary instruments which could allow closure of the protection gap. And that is because insurance penetration in other parts of the world than United States and Western Europe is minimal, close to nothing. I mean, it's like somewhere it's like statistical mistake. Insurance, unfortunately, macroeconomically, cannot play a serious role for those nations. So they need to be inventive and start using instruments different from insurance, but those which can protect their populations from devastating events. And that is where actually use of ILS instruments and use of things like, for example, sovereign parametric catastrophe bonds could be a real solution, especially because out of wherever possible post-disaster risk finance, in several territories, ILS and transfer of the risk to private capital markets is not one of it's the only vital solution. Because depending on geostrategical situation, depending on political situation, depending on historical situation, some regions, they cannot go for sovereign pools, for example, because they are too fragmented. Some regions may have an issue with international help because of their status or their political regimes. Some nations again for political reasons, cannot freely use international instruments like, for example, World Bank catastrophe CDDOs. But transfer of the risk, and sovereign risk in particular, to private investors through well-known, well-established instruments, in many circumstances quite a unique situation when a pool of investors who are obviously looking for profit can play a really important role in the closure of the protection gap on a much wider basis. And that is why investors treat and look into ILS allocations as an impact investment. And it's something becoming more and more important amongst different cycles, that actually allocating for ILS is not only making money, but also doing something good for the impact investment.
And it's another example of ILS not as a competitor to reinsurance, traditional reinsurance.
Of course.
But as a complement.
Of course. It's always complementing each other, and proper mixture, proper use of the mixture of both can bring really strong results.
It seems like a strong solution. To what degree is that lack of knowledge about the options holding it back, do you think?
That is actually a fundamental problem, to my opinion, because almost every cycle needs a proper education about insurance-linked securities. Moreover, believe it or not, if you put into one room sitting reinsurance buyer, official from whatever government looking after disaster relief, and institutional investor thinking of allocation to ILS, all three of them will be very interested in these magic three letters, but they will be perceiving them from completely different angles. And that is why a complex education and closure of this education gap is as important as closure of the global catastrophe protection gap. And I think it's a very big way to go for all of us in insurance, for all of us in the risk transfer industry. We need to educate more, we need to educate investors, and everybody who is working in ILS will tell you that it's a question. This point raised in each and every conference dedicated to ILS. So we need to educate investors, we need to educate government officials, because they are far away from understanding of this. They think that it's a really rocket science, while it's a steady, well-working instrument, and there is nothing special about use of this. It's just proper understanding of how this works. And obviously, there is another big room for growth, is starting for use of ILS by insurance companies, medium-sized, small-sized, in different jurisdictions than US and other usual suspects.
Kirill, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Richard.
For AM Best TV, I'm Richard Banks.